Welcome to Afrometrics research-based news, highlighting new and emerging research across the African world. And our special guest today is Dr. Teisha Dupree-Wilson. Dr. Dupree-Wilson is an assistant professor of history at Coppin State University. She's a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and received her BA in history from Howard University. She went on to obtain her law degrees from Northwestern California University School of Law. And her law school trial and appellate advocacy thesis is entitled "The Conscience of the Community: Race, Gender, and Jury Nullification in the Criminal Justice System," which is very relevant today. And the thesis examined the history of racism against African Americans in the convictions and sentencing in the US court system. And during her time in the legal field, she worked for 2 private law firms before accepting an appointment with the US Department of Justice and later the US Securities and Exchange Commission. Although Dr. Dupree-Wilson spent many years in the field of law, she recognized that her professional calling was tied to her never-ending passion for history. And this led her to pursue a career in history through museums and academia. She went on to earn her MA and PhD in history from Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. And her doctoral work highlights the impact and influence of Philadelphia's Black radio stations and disc jockeys during the era of the Civil Rights Movement. And Dr. Dupree-Wilson's current research focuses on the role of African-American media in covering and encouraging civil rights activism and the impact of Black lawyers during the era of Jim Crow. And she is the recipient of a number of awards, including a diversity fellowship with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. She also served as the education coordinator for the Lillie Carroll Jackson Civil Rights Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. She's a proud member of Phi Alpha Theta National History Honor Society, and it's the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, an Association of Black Women Historians, the Association of African American Museums, Phi Delta Phi International Law Fraternity, the National Council of Negro Women, and Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Dr. Dupree-Wilson's most recent peer-reviewed publications include Killing Dixie, the NAACP, the Black Press, and the Crusade to End Black Caricature Culture in Hollywood from 1950 to 1969, and Phenotypic Proximity, Colorism, and Intraracial Discrimination among Blacks in the United States and in Brazil from 1928 to 1988, which is the article that we're going to discuss today. And Dr. Dupree-Wilson, thank you for accepting my invitation and welcome to Afrometrics research-based news show.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and one thing that I wanted to ask you about that was mentioned in your bio is that you realized this calling was related to your passion for history. So what made you realize that you had this professional calling in the area of history?
I think one of the things that made me realize it is that history has always followed me, even when I wasn't looking for it. As a child, even going on family vacations, my parents would find a way to weave history into the trip. Like we would go to Busch Gardens, and then my dad would say, "No, we're going to go to Jamestown too. We're going to look at battlefields. We're going to," so it was always a part of my life. And even, working in the legal field, I would just break into historical talking points and people like, what does this have to do? But it was just always something that interested me. And it was something that I just kept putting off. Oh, I'll go back and get the PhD. I'll go back and get it. But for me, it was something that was so undeniable. And just being in academia kind of confirmed for me that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. When you wake up in the morning and you love your job, you love working with students, you love mentoring, you love history or shedding light on situations that people don't realize have historical context, for me is just the best thing ever. So I honestly think that I made the right choice to go back and get the PhD and to pursue a career in history, because I just absolutely love what I do.
Wow. And was your dad a history buff?
Yes, he still is. He even today he knows all the presidents. Even when we're sitting watching, did you know in 1862 this happened? Mind you, he's an electrician by trade.
Okay.
But he's always been a history buff. And I think I have a lot of that in me as well. He's a disc jockey too. And even, talking about records, this was recorded in 1968, and that was right after the King murder. And, he always finds a way to weave history, even into music, talking about music. And I think I got it honest, quite frankly. So my mom does that as well. Uh, Even like I remember one time we were at Disney World and my sister and I were complaining about all the walking we had to do. Well, oh my God, there's so much walking. And my mom is like, well, how do you think Harriet Tubman felt? She had to walk from Maryland to Philly, and you're complaining about walking from the park, so it's always like I can't even go on vacation without them trying to put seeds of history into what we do. So it was just all over the place. So my mom was a school teacher as well. So.
Wow. Yeah, I'm hearing all of the connections, things coming together from your research to your upbringing, because you looked at the history of the disc jockeys, and then there's law and Jim Crow and historical approach that you seem to take. Well, the particular article that we're discussing, which was published in a very prestigious Journal of Black Studies, for the purposes of that, can you give our listeners a working definition of colorism?
A working definition of colorism would be basically, in a nutshell, the act of discriminating against an individual based on the hue or shade of their skin. Typically, you're looking more for a preference of lighter skin, something that is similar in tone to a European physical feature. Sometimes colorism can also extend to eye color. It could also extend to the texture of one's hair, but primarily you're looking at someone's hue or complexion, again, favoring, of course, a more lighter complexion.
Okay, thank you for that. And before we get into the actual article, how did you become interested in the influence of colorism on the cultures of people of African descent?
Well, like everything in my life, it was really influenced by my upbringing, my childhood. I never experienced colorism in my family, but growing up, let's just say I grew up with a lot of color-struck people. When I was younger, it was more so adults that were perpetuate colorism in situations. I remember being a little girl, I think I was in like 3rd grade. And I remember all of the Black teachers marveling over this little girl, Angelique. Angelique was like the nicest girl ever, light-skinned Black girl, wavy, like honey blonde hair, blue eyes. Look at Angelique. They would sit at lunch. Look at Angelique. She's so beautiful. When she grows up, she's never going to have a problem, finding a husband. These are adults, right? So you're hearing this as an 8 or 9-year-old kid, and you're like, what's wrong? What's wrong with me?
Right.
Am I not, or the other girls in the class, So that I think was the first time that I kind of figured out that this whole colorism thing was a thing. And then I was at church one time, and I remember this lady saying to me, you and your sister, you have a nice braid of hair. And I didn't know what that meant. And I told my mom, and my mom kind of just rolled her eyes and said, oh, she just means your hair is healthy. Because my mom was an individual that poured into our spirit that African heritage, African ancestry is an asset. It's not a disadvantage. So she never allowed the notion of colorism to creep into our spirits. I mean, she drove us to school playing Gil Scott-Heron and Nina Simone. So you're going to get out of this house believing that you're Black and beautiful, whether you like it or not, So for me, I think that was really my first connection to colorism. And also one of the reasons why I was interested in colorism is because I just don't understand it. And the reason why I don't understand it is because it just seems odd to me that you would tell a person that your upward mobility, the fact that you would be considered beautiful, is only tied to the way you look, is tied to whether or not your features mimic that of a European. And to me, I just, even, you know, at my age, I didn't understand as a kid, and now I still don't understand it. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of pursue the topic. So.
Wow. Would you say that your mother's messages to you kind of protected you from the impact of those comments?
I would, because I think because my mom is a very dark-skinned woman, she experienced colorism in her childhood, and I would hear stories from her. And I think, you know, even without trying to, she wanted to shield us from not having to go through what she went through, being teased about being dark-skinned. And also, she's a very militant woman. You know, she went to college in the early 70s during the Black Studies movement and that sort of thing. So I think it really, in a lot of ways, was her way of just kind of putting a little bubble around us so that we would not have that mentality tied into our minds that, you know, there's something wrong with you, that having African features is a marker for you being inferior. Like, that was just never something that she poured into our spirits. And I did have friends whose parents did pour that into a spirit. And I just looked, and I, you know, as I told you before, I grew up with a lot of color struck people. And I remember one of my friends, and she was absolutely beautiful girl, saying, God screwed me over. He gave my brother green eyes and gave my other sibling wavy hair, and I got nothing. And I'm looking at her like, you're really a pretty girl. But she had been fed that by her parents, you know, because they would always comment on how attractive her other siblings were, but they would never say anything to her. So I think that in a lot of ways, my mom did not want us to believe that there was something wrong with being a person of African descent, because that's a good thing, right? To celebrate
Absolutely.
who you are. You know, it's evidence of the greatness, because whether we like it or not, you know, we are evidence that someone survived that Middle Passage. We are evidence that someone was able to survive the chains of slavery and Jim Crow and all that other stuff. So how is that a disadvantage? You know, you're a survivor. So, you know, my mom really, I really thank her for that. And even now she does that with the grandkids too, instilling self-esteem in them, which I really appreciate. So
Yeah. And you, you're from Philadelphia,
yes.
right? And I'm from Chicago. I have a background, my family has a background in Mississippi. And
Okay.
I'm familiar with the term color struck. And, you know, when you talk about the individuals who were in the lunchroom at school making these comments, it resonates to me in terms of that term color struck. But can you say a little bit about what that means when a person is color struck?
It basically means that you believe in what colorism is. You believe that if you are lighter, that you're more beautiful, or if you're choosing a mate, you want to go for a lighter complected person because you want to procreate with someone that will give you a child with quote unquote good hair. I still hear adults, grown adults, using that term good hair today, or favoring the procreating with someone because you want lighter complected kids. But I just remember a lot of individuals I grew up with, they were just, you know, I'm only dating light-skinned guys. You know, I have to have this kind of person, you know, and that sort of thing. Or I'm not pretty enough because I'm not light enough. And it just never made sense to me. And I still don't get it. And maybe it's a good thing that I don't get it. But there are a lot of people, even today, they try to hide it more. But there are still a lot of color-struck folks among us. You know, you could, back in the day, say that it was a symptom of the time, you know, during the Jim Crow era and that sort of thing. But now, I don't understand what this excuse would be to be color-struck. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You chose to write about intraracial discrimination. And what made you make that decision? Because all the examples, for example, that you gave just now are about intraracial discrimination. What made you make that decision? Why was that important?
I think it's important because I think it's really damaging to put restrictions or to even, I would say, perpetuate white supremacy among ourselves. I think that is very damaging because let's face it, we got enough to battle because racism in this society is alive and well. And I think for us to do it to each other just adds fuel to the fire because you're basically justifying white supremacy. You're basically justifying racial hierarchy. And for me, I just don't understand how you can go through experiencing racism and then want to perpetuate it against a fellow person of African descent. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I see it not just within the African-American context, but I see it, from Black Americans to Afro-Caribbeans or Afro-Caribbeans towards Black. I see it all over. And I feel as though, if we unite, if we build one up, each other up, I feel as though we will be a powerful force. But unfortunately, we have these hangups to say that if I look like a person, if I have these thin features or light hair or this and that I'm more beautiful than my darker brother and sister. And that just, to me, is very, very damaging to have that mentality.
I think that's an important point you just made, that highlighting something like this can be empowering. How is it that highlighting something like this phenomenon can be empowering?
Well, I think it's empowering because you have to recognize that it exists. A lot of times we don't want to recognize that certain things exist, right? We don't want to believe that there are people that hold the belief that because you're a lighter Black person, that you're more beautiful. There are people that still hold that belief. And for me, I just feel as though in order to cure a problem, you have to acknowledge that said problem exists. And if we're going to say that, we all love each other, Black is beautiful, Black is Black, that is true. But at the same time, if you're teasing a child because they have darker skin, or you're telling, I don't know if you guys did it in Chicago, they used to do the dozens and the your mama jokes and this person is Black and, all that other stuff, that kids remember things that they experienced when they were little. I've interviewed a number of people who are in their 70s and they still remember being teased about their dark skin when they were like 8 or 9 years old. So
I remember every one of them, everyone. Mm-hmm. So, and I went to an all boys high school. So that was a major part of it. Yeah. And your approach, your perspective is a global one in this paper, because you look at the United States and you look at Brazil, which is very interesting contrast that you're able to, and similarities that you're able to identify. Why did you choose the United States and Brazil?
Well, I chose the United States obviously because I'm a Black American, and I know what I witnessed growing up in terms of colorism. And I just thought that, colorism was an African American thing. But then, doing research and also talking to a lot of Afro-Latino folks, I'm like, you guys are just as bad as we are, in terms of colorism. And then there are people that believe we shouldn't be talking about this. This is family business. Don't talk about it. We need to focus on, white folks being racist towards us, which we do. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But Brazil in particular, I found very interesting, primarily, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there was a young lady by the name of Nayara Justino. In 2013, she was crowned Queen of the Carnival in Brazil. Beautiful, beautiful woman, drop dead gorgeous, dark skinned lady. She was the first dark skinned Queen of the Carnival. A lot of people in Brazil were very upset that she was crowned as the Queen of the Carnival. to the point where they were sending her death threats. They were threatening to murder her family members. And the public outcry was so heavy that they stripped her title from her without even giving her notice, only because she was a dark-skinned Afro-Brazilian girl. That was it. So after I read about that, I'm like, oh my goodness, you know, Brazil always pretends to be like this racial democracy, nothing to see here, we're not racist, everybody's equal. But if that was the case, then why is it a problem when someone who is a dark-skinned Afro-Brazilian is crowned Queen of the Carnival? Do we have to do death threats, you know, because she doesn't look what a beautiful quote unquote person looks like? So that's why I decided to focus on Brazil. And also the other thing too is with Brazil, it had the largest population of enslaved Africans in the Western Hemisphere. So obviously, you know, colorism is going to be an issue there because there were so many Black people there before emancipation there in 1888 and then after. So.
Wow. And one of the things you mentioned just a little bit earlier in this very conversation was that colorism is also associated with hair. And that's something that I didn't, I mean, I know that they're all related, of course, but I didn't know that. But the reason I mention it is because of how recently the Crown Act has been part of a lot of conversation, which is related to hairstyle, etc. And I wanted to ask you how, if at all, is colorism, skin color discrimination's impact different than other phenotypic forms of discrimination?
I would say colorism, when you're dealing with the skin, is more impactful only because there's not a lot you can really do about your skin. I mean, there are instances where people have attempted to bleach their skin and they just look crazy or like, you know, kind of pale. Whereas with your hair, you can chemically alter your hair. You know, you can get a relaxer, you can dye it if you want to, and even with your eye color, if you want to wear those contacts or things like that, you could do that. Those things can be altered, whereas your skin, you can't do much about in terms of, you know, lightening it if that would be your desire. So I think a lot of emphasis has been on skin color over hair, to your point, because of that fact. You know, if I want to be natural, I could be natural, get my hair blown out, I could do that. Or if people want to, you know, use the relaxer, they could do that. But with my skin is my skin. So I think a lot of times people put more emphasis on skin complexion than they would someone's hair or even their eye color.
Yeah. You talk about the these two contexts, the two histories. And that's what I really enjoyed the most was how you drew these contrasts between the evolution of colorism in Brazil compared to United States. Can you talk about that? The different evolution of colorism in Brazil compared to the United States?
Sure. Well, with Brazil, the history, although of course Brazil and the United States both had slavery, was a different, distinct history because with Brazil, you had a majority Black population. Because when the Portuguese men came over, they didn't bring, you know, their white Portuguese wives or, you know, mates with them. So for that reason, they started to sexually exploit African women, rape African women. And I don't buy into the whole, oh, well, it was a consensual relationship. Can you have a consensual relationship with someone who you have enslaved? So I don't buy into that, but that's a whole nother conversation. But, you know, you're procreating, having children through sexual violence with African women. So they kind of developed like this intermediate population of mixed race folks because they needed someone because they were the minority. Whereas in the United States, a lot of settlers came here as whole families. You had, you know, European men come over with their wives and children. And although they sexually exploited Black women in this country as well, the population still favored whites, whereas they were the majority and Blacks were the minority. Blacks have never been more than 13% of the population in the United States, whereas in Brazil, it was the exact opposite. So in Brazil, you had about maybe 40 categories of race. In the United States, you know the deal. One drop of African blood, that's all you need to make you Black. And I think at some point they broke it down to 1/16. If you're 1/16 Black, you're Black. In Brazil, you can self-identify as whatever you want to based on how you look. Whereas in the United States, we know with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, you know, he was 1/8 Black, looked like a white man. You're Black. It doesn't matter what you look like. But in Brazil, you can self-identify however you want. And of course, you're going to favor European ancestry because it gets you advantages. Because again, minority population of whites, I need an intermediate group, you know, too many Black folks here. So those mixed race folks are an intermediate group. So let's give them a little bit of advantages so that they won't turn on us, so that we'll be able to hold the power. So I think with skin complexion and phenotypic proximity to whiteness came, of course, advantages. And that's how colorism developed in Brazil. Whereas, you know, in the United States, it was, of course, both of them are byproducts of white supremacy, but it just developed in a different way. Because you can't self-identify. You can self-identify how you want to in the United States, but we call it passing, right? Mm-hmm. Whenever a Black person who looks white pretends to be white, we say the person's passing. In Brazil, you're not passing. I can say I'm white if I look white, and that's the end of it.
Wow, that's interesting. What it brings to mind is the autobiography or the narrative from Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where she kind of highlights some of the things that you just mentioned, the colorism and mixed with the sexual exploitation as well, the passing, and from the perspective of a Black woman.
Right, right.
And so how does gender change or alter the impact or the role of colorism, or how colorism is experienced?
That's an excellent question. Gender is definitely going to play a part in how colorism manifests itself. In both the United States and in Brazil, colorism impacts Black women more deeply than it does men. I'll look at Brazil first. In Brazil, if you are a dark skinned person, an Afro Brazilian man, you can quote unquote overcome being dark if you go to school, get degrees, make money, or if you become an athlete, you know, a football player or soccer player. In the United States, I would say probably around maybe the early 90s, dark-skinned Black men became like these sex symbols. You know, you had the Morris Chestnuts, the Big Daddy Kanes, the Wesley Snipes, and, you know, Idris Elbas and all those guys. You know, you can be a sex symbol if you're a dark-skinned man. Whereas if you're a dark-skinned woman, you'll hear people say things like they used to say to my mom, oh, she's pretty for a dark-skinned girl. Like you're kind of an exception to the rule. So it's very difficult for women, both in the realm of Brazil and in the United States, to overcome colorism, because the feeling in Brazil, especially amongst wealthy dark-skinned men, is I don't have to settle for a dark Afro-Brazilian wife. I can get me a white wife now. I can get me a lighter complected wife so that my children will be lighter, you know. And even in the United States, right, we see colorism every day. I mean, we see it in videos, we see it in magazines, typically even with the skin bleaching that I touch on in the article. These ads were geared toward women. And the ad would say something to the effect of, you know, if you bleach your skin, men are going to be falling all over you. If you're lighter, men will, you know, be knocking down your door. I surveyed tons and tons and tons of ads, and I didn't see any ads geared toward men in my research. So I would definitely say that it's more difficult for women to overcome colorism versus a man, because again, in Brazil, you can leverage it with having wealth. And in the United States, a lot of times darker men have become sex symbols. And I remember one time being laughed at because I said that Grace Jones was pretty. And someone looked at me like, ugh, look at her hair and she's dark. And I said, Grace Jones, are you kidding me? You know, look at her bone structure, beautiful, smooth skin. What are you talking about? You know, and I just found it interesting that the first thing they said was that, oh, she's dark and her hair is nappy. I think that was the word that they used. But again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. So, you know.
Yeah, that's it. Now you have a legal background as well, which I mean, mentioned in the introduction, and you done this trial and appellate advocacy thesis on conscience of the community, and you examined the history of racism against African Americans in convictions and sentencing. Had you, just by chance, had you found that color, skin complexion played a role in the sentencing and convictions?
I would
come across
say
anything like that?
No,
Okay.
not skin complexion. And that's an interesting point that you make. Because a lot of times white individuals, not all of them, but a lot of them don't see shades the way that we see shades as African Americans or people of color. You know, when you describe someone, you'll say, oh, she's brown skinned, short, you know, but a white person will describe that same person and say, oh, she's black, short. You know what I'm saying? So in my research findings in terms of jury nullification, all you had to do was be black. You could be the lightest of light or the darkest of dark, but that all white jury will see you as a black person, which to me is interesting because, you know, we're emphasizing the amount of the melanin that's in our skin, which we have no control over, right? You get what you get at birth. But others are seeing us as you're either black or you're not, you know? So I think a lot of times, you know, sometimes some of the wounds that we put on our own community are self-inflicted. A lot of it, again, because I always tell people who subscribe to colorism, you're an agent of white supremacy by continuing to perpetuate this mentality that someone deserves social mobility because they look like a white person. But in reality, you know, jury nullification and the criminal justice system, all I need to see on your record is your race, you know, and I just think of all the individuals that went to prison, and I'll use cocaine as an example, with the sentencing different for cocaine, crack cocaine and powder cocaine. It's all cocaine, but if it's crack cocaine, it carries a different sentence versus powder cocaine. Now, who's using powder and who's using the crack cocaine? So to me, I feel as though the justice system has a lot of flaws, but one of the flaws that it doesn't have is it's very clear about who it favors and who it doesn't. And whether you're light or dark, it doesn't matter. If you check that box that we need you to check, that's all that matters. And we know what that box is.
Absolutely. And when I was reading about your descriptions, your analysis of colorism and how it evolved in different contexts, one thing that it made me want to ask you was ways of resistance, how people resisted colorism. Can you talk about anything you came across in terms of resistance?
With the United States, definitely there was a resistance of colorism that emerged with the Black Power movement. You know, the mid to late 1960s, going into the 70s. There was a Black is Beautiful movement, right? We started to see people embrace natural hair, African texture hair. We also started to see the HBCUs, who always crowned light complected women as, you know, Miss Howard or Miss Hampton or whomever, start to crown darker women as the homecoming queen. So I think a lot of it has to do with knowing who you are it had to do with the knowledge of your ancestry. And when you start reading African history, I don't see how you cannot be proud of who you are and you know, the people that make up your gene pool. So for me, I think that in terms of the United States, that whole movement that emerged in the 1960s helped to catapult the notion of Black is beautiful, and it countered colorism in a lot of ways. And I would even take it further than that and look at the golden era of hip hop, when there was this embrace of Black nationalist ideologies by, you know, the Native Tongues and the Public Enemies and all those guys. And, you know, looking at yourself as an individual of African heritage and knowing, again, as my mom always told us, your African heritage is an asset. You know, it's not a setback. So for the United States, I would say that. In Brazil, you also had a pushback against it because, as I mentioned before, there's been this myth in Brazil that they are a racial democracy. Oh, we don't do racism. And they would say, oh, we're not like America. You know, that's the gold standard of racism, right? American racism. Oh, we're not as bad as the America. But you had a lot of Afro-Brazilians protesting against the notion of this whole idea of racial democracy. We're not a racial democracy. There's racism in Brazil. There's colorism in Brazil. And I think those activists who forced Brazil to have that conversation really helped to flourish the movement against colorism in Brazil. So, you know, different manifestations, I would say definitely with Brazil happened more in the 1980s, whereas with the United States, it kind of started in the 60s. So.
Okay. Definitely. And as far as how things are today, have you seen, and I know your study, just to remind people that it looked in between 1920s and 1980s. Mm-hmm. Do you see any evolution between, say, the 1980s colorism and today? Has it evolved in any ways or remained the same, would you say?
I would say it has evolved a little bit. It's not used as a ticket into social circles anymore, the way it used to be. You know, and I have this here with me, the brown paper bag where you would pull your arm up and put it against, and if you're lighter, you can get in the club. If not, you can't get in the club. Right. Those days are gone. But I will say that I would say it's more, it's not as overt as it used to be. You know, it's just personal. People say, well, it's just my personal preference. You know, I heard a guy say, well, I don't like women that are darker than me, and that's just my personal preference. You know, that's still colorism. But it is not as, I would say, as uniformed as it used to be in terms of people literally using your hue to keep you out of certain situations. Because if there's a group or something that does something like, I don't want to have dealings with it. You know, but I would definitely say that it has evolved a little bit, but it's still among us. There are still people that believe that in colorism, they believe that, you know, your proximity to whiteness and how you look should determine how far you go in life. Even if they don't have the power to stop you from doing something, it's still in their mind. So I would say it still lives among us. It's just not as bad as it used to be, per se.
Not as bad. And you mentioned how people are practicing it still on an interpersonal level. Right. Sounds like, and all the way back from, I mean, when you were in that lunchroom or you were in a school as a child, you're hearing these messages. And today, you know, you hear people say those messages about who they would and would not date. What would you say what's the psychological impact of even hearing those comments?
I would say it definitely has a psychological impact on you because you never forget it. You know, a lot of times adults will say something to a child and the adult won't remember that they said it years later, but that child never forgets what they heard that adult say to them. And as I told you before, a lot of what I do is oral history, and I like to interview people for my research projects. And a lot of the people that I've interviewed, they're in their late 60s, early 70s, and they can still remember instances where they endured colorism. And they can tell you word for word what was said to them. This person, made fun of me. And some of them will even get teary-eyed about it. And it just goes to show you that when you plant the seed in someone to make them feel inferior, or kind of tell them that they're not as good as the next person because they look a certain way, that, I mean, it kind of reminds me of that whole doll test that they did with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, where they asked the children, which doll is the pretty doll, which doll is the ugly doll. That kind of impact on a child, and not even just a child, but like a teenager, stays with you for a really long time. And it does impact how you think about yourself. And if you don't have someone to counter that message in your life, then you're going to start, a part of you is going to actually start to believe it, I think. But there are ways to come back from it, but you have to know who you are. Because once you know who you are, all that outside noise about you're inferior because you have Black blood and this stuff, all that out the window. But if you're not instilling those values into children early on, it's hard to come back from that, I believe.
Well, definitely. I mean, you mentioned early on the armor that you received from your, I would say maybe psychological armor you received from your mom. Mm-hmm. Are there other things that you say would give Black people, Black children, Black even adults, the internal armor to protect against those the psychological impact of colorism?
I would say history, because I even look at my students when I'm teaching, when I do my slavery, whenever I do my slavery course, I don't start with, Jamestown, Port Comfort, Hampton. I go back to the beginning. I do ancestral Africa. And whenever I do ancestral Africa with, I call them kids, they get mad when I call them my kids, with my students, they come out of the class with like a little swagger when they start to hear these stories that are true about about their African ancestry and their heritage. So I believe that if you teach children history, which is something that we don't do, because a lot of my students will tell me, I never heard this story in high school. I never heard about these individuals who were warriors, who had governments set up, who were running kingdoms. I never heard about that. I heard about they put us on a slave boat, brought us to America, and that was the end of it. And I said, no. You're not the descendant of a slave. You're a descendant of someone who was enslaved. There's a difference. So for me, I think the best way to combat the notion that there's something wrong with African heritage is to tell the truth. And you can't do that unless you're, teaching people about their history. You have to tell people about their history. And at the same time, we cannot depend on the school systems to do it for us. A lot of the history that I learned growing up, I did not learn at school. I learned from my parents giving me these books saying, you need to read about this person. They ran this kingdom. You need to read about and I think if once we do that, we can put into the atmosphere that you're okay as a person of color or a Black person. There's nothing wrong with you, because a lot of people are made to believe that there's something wrong with them if they are descended from African heritage. And even growing up, we were taught that Africa was this weird place and people are inferior and that sort of thing. That is an absolute bold-faced lie. And I always tell people, Europeans would not have spent that much time in Africa if there was nothing to offer there. You're not going to hang out in a place that has no value. So Africa has a lot of value, and we need to start teaching people that there's nothing wrong with being a person of African descent. And that'll cure, I believe, a lot of the problems that we have.
And I'm not surprised that you mentioned history actually as a tool, because Black historians for centuries have presented history as a tool of empowerment.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
All the earliest of Black historians have looked at the role of history, not just as a tool of like recounting the past, but as an instrument of empowerment. So that makes sense to me. I also know that you did some research on Hollywood and
Yes.
depictions of Black people, and I wanted to ask you. You've seen the you have new categories on Amazon Prime or Netflix, the shows, the new movies that feature Black casts and no pun intended, Black cat, but like the depictions of color and maybe increased presence or availability, accessibility of Black films. Would you say that colorism in Hollywood or in media has changed at all in the past 20 or so years?
I would definitely say yes. We have moved the needle. But I think it's because we've demanded it, and the same deal with the period that I've researched where I looked at the NAACP and the African-American media basically forced Hollywood to change. Hollywood didn't have this aha moment. We're going to start. No, Walter White of the NAACP said, you're going to change because I said so. And if not, we're going to protest against you. We're going to, because let's face it, Hollywood is a business. You hit people in their pockets, you hit them where it hurts. So I think the change that has happened, in modern Hollywood in the last 20 years has been because we've demanded representation, Black directors, African-American actors and actresses who don't all look exactly the same, and there's diversity, and then also you have people who want to see themselves on the screen, because a lot of times if you can't see something, it's hard to imagine it. I always tell people growing up, you saw, Claire Huxtable on the Cosby Show, and you said, wait a minute, there's a Black woman who's an attorney. I think I can do that. Or you see Aunt Viv, right, on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. She's a college professor, a history professor. I want to be like Aunt Viv, but prior to that, you had to either be a Beulah or you had to be, someone from the cast of Amos and Andy. But as you start to see representation, my aunt became a nurse because of Diane Carroll. You start to see yourself, Julia, on television, and you feel as though, although this is fictitious, I can do that too, because I see it. And sometimes people need to see themselves represented to feel that something can be accomplished. So, yeah.
Okay. You are a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I think that in their tradition, the work that you're doing, I think it uses history, and to reference something you said earlier in our conversation, that it is a tool of empowerment. The way that you have, not only the way that you have highlighted the role of colorism, how it's resistance, even your own personal story, it uses history as a tool of empowerment in the tradition of that organization. I think that your research is very consistent with the organization's mission. The other thing about it is that it's international, and pointing out the commonality and differences in the experiences of people of African descent from one geographical location to the next, again, I think also can be a major pretext for collaboration, for unity, and common experience, common identity, from a Pan-African perspective. So I really appreciate you having this conversation. Are there any things that you wanted to mention about your work that we hadn't covered?
Well, just with my research, I try to be consistent in terms of the things that I bring out as it relates to people of African descent. And a lot of times, one of the themes that I like to touch upon is resistance, which brings us to a lot of different places, right?
Yeah.
Looking at slavery, a lot of students are shocked to know that there was never a year that went by where there wasn't resistance against the chains of slavery. But we're taught to believe that Black people just sat there, took it, and then in 1965, we had an aha moment and woke up and started fighting back, when that wasn't the reality. And I think even in colorism, if you want it to stop, you have to fight against it. My research on Black radio, a lot of times the DJs who were superheroes to a lot of people used their platform to bring awareness to things that needed to change. So they would encourage resistance. And a person with a microphone and a platform is one of the most powerful individuals ever. So, I just feel as though when we have the opportunity to fight against the chains of oppression, we need to, one, again, teach the history, let people know where you're coming from in order to empower you to know that you can do it. It's in your DNA. And also to remember who you are in all instances. And also to try to know that even though we may come from different places, I may be a Black American, you may be an Afro-Caribbean, or you may be a Black from Europe or whatever. At the end of the day, our struggle has a lot more similarities than you think. A lot of my Afro-Caribbean friends are shocked to know that we have more in common than we thought we would, and even because a lot of times, and this is interesting, they'll see you as not as an African American, they see you as an American. Mm-hmm. And what that means is your behavior looks like that of white Americans, when in reality, I have more in common with my Bayesian friends than I do with white Americans, other Americans. So I think to your point with the Pan-Africanist perspective, it's very important that we look at struggle and not just in our situation, but in every situation, because all of them have value and all of them have the ability to teach us something very important. I had no idea there was a Black Power movement in London until I started doing research into it. And I'm actually teaching a course this semester on Blacks in Europe. And it's very interesting that a lot of the struggles that we have had here as African Americans mirror that of those Afro-Caribbeans that, migrated to Europe. So very important that we stick together in this thing, because, no one owns struggle. It's something that we all experience.
Absolutely. And and when you talk about teaching the resistance, the kind of things that Black people have done in resistance is, we're talking stuff that is more thrilling, death-defying, suspenseful than a lot of the fictitious Hollywood stories.
Absolutely.
It still boggles my mind why the History Channel Drunk History of Harriet Tubman came out before the movie Harriet, mm-hmm. In a comical way, I think that the History Channel one, but the kind of things that people did, you couldn't even make a fictitious story to top the things that like a Robert Small did,
right?
And the stories of just ordinary people who fought in the Civil War and mm-hmm. came back and freed the people on the plantation that their children were enslaved on. And it's just it's filled with action and inspiration. So absolutely right.
Right. And it's amazing. I always tell people, yes, I'm Black, but I'm also a fan of Black people, because I look at our history and I'm like, how in the world? How in the world? I remember reading about this one slave he said it was his calling to free people. So he escaped and took people with him. They caught him. took him back to his master. He escaped again the second time. They caught him again. He escaped the third time. And after the third, they're like, you know what? I'm not, he's like, this is what I do. You know, I escape. And whenever I escape, I take folks with me. And even those Black women who were cooking the food, and these masters couldn't understand why they were always sick. You're sick because who's prepping your food? Now, that is resistance. It may be passive resistance, or me burning crops and saying the crop never came in. That is resistance. But, you know, we're often made to feel like we didn't fight back. And that's one of the things that I make it my mission to teach my students, that there was never a time when Black people did not fight against the chains of their oppression. You know, slavery was not a choice. But if I'm 13% of the population and 87% of the population has guns, I have to do what I have to do to survive. But I'm not choosing to be enslaved. And resistance is my way of letting you know that I'm not choosing to be a slave. So it's very interesting, and it's very important that we start to beat on that point, because it really bothers me when people assume that those who weren't enslaved are like somehow weak, that they just sat there and just didn't fight back. It's not true.
Absolutely not. And so a lot of those towns, as you know, that had ordinances that required whites to carry those guns is because resistance was so certain to happen or imminent. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you once again. Thank you for accepting the invitation and joining. And I would encourage people to seek out the scholarship that you've produced, and I'm sure that is also forthcoming. And I will put any social media that you give me, I'll put below the video.
Thank you. So, thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for joining. We learned a lot, and we'll see everybody next time on Afrometrics Research-Based News.